Developing Technologies. The Association for Computing Machinery hosts this Our 20-Minute event.
Our next panel will be talking about privacy and security and what the relationship between the two are. My name is Ryan Single. I'm a staff writer for Wired.com, and I've been covering privacy, security, and the intersection with technology for about 6 years now. Curtains, the cloth you hang on your windows, are the most common privacy-enhancing technology in the world. They allow us to live our lives free from the invasive gaze of our neighbors and the police. But arguably, they also create a society that is less secure, allowing citizens, law-abiding or not, to escape, to do what they want to do in the privacy of their homes. But there's no argument about the legality of curtains. You don't need a permit. And the police, if they want to get past those curtains, they need to go to a judge and prove to him they have a reasonable cause to get into your home. That's because the constitutional bargain that the founders set recognizes that individual privacy rights balance the government's right to come into your house. And that protects the security of democracy by placing a check on government power. But in today's age of massive databases about citizens' lives, a surveillance infrastructure that's baked into our communications networks, and living in a world with religious extremists willing to make political point by killing millions of people, the questions about the relationship between security and privacy are both harder and more important. So today's panel is going to explore the question about what is the relationship between security and privacy and whether they are in tension or work together. And today we'll start with short presentations and then follow that on with some questions and a lot of audience participation. So we'll start with Stewart Baker. Mr. Baker is a lawyer at Steptoe & Johnson, where he focuses on government and technology, cybersecurity. From 1992 to 1994, he was the general counsel at the National Security Agency. That was in the middle of the crypto wars when the Clinton administration wanted to create the Clipper chip, which was an encryption module with a backdoor for law enforcement. From 2005 to 2009, he started and served as the Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Homeland Security. That office had responsibility for international affairs, including negotiating data sharing agreements with the EU, setting cybersecurity policy, and examining future threats to the U.S. arising from technology. And he's now working on a book about those topics. Mr. Baker also wanted me to note that in 2007, he won the Big Brother Award for Worst Government Official, and edging out Alberto Gonzalez and Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, I wanted to bring that up because it's my understanding that the FTC often sends people to these conferences. Is there somebody here from the FTC? Because I have to say, you know, if you go to the Privacy International website, they describe this trophy in loving detail. It's a hobnailed jackboot descending on a human head. And so I said, okay, I want it, right? I've got a spot on my mantle. They have yet to produce it. This is an online come-on that does not actually result in giving you the merchandise that has been promised to you. You know, you beat out Vladimir Putin. You know, come on, there ought to be something in it. All right, so I was disappointed. As you can tell, I'm no longer in government. And as I've said to many people, the good news about not being in government is that you can say what you want, because the bad news is nobody cares. And so I would, in that spirit, I'm going to try to talk to you a little bit about why I think the privacy community is misplacing some of its priorities in continuing to fight old battles when much more dangerous threats are in store for us. And in that regard, I'd like to get a show of hands for the question that's behind me. I've also put it up on Twitter, which is, and in fact, if you want to tweet your vote, that's fine too, and somebody will keep track of it, I hope. just a show of hands, next 10 years, the biggest threat to privacy, you got a choice, China, the United States, or organized crime. China? Okay. Maybe 5% of the audience. United States? Maybe 40% of the audience. And organized crime? I would say that's close to 50. Okay, well that is interesting and better than I expected out of CFP. So maybe this won't be quite as surprising to you as I'd hoped it would be. Because but in fact, I think I would have put a much higher vote on the Chinese, and the reason for that is what I'm going to talk about today very briefly is the GhostNet report, which many of you have seen. This is a report done by a Canadian group about efforts by a group of hackers that they refuse to quite attribute to the Chinese government, but they come very close to attributing it. And it's significant, I think, because what was done here could be done to any of us, and probably for many of the people here has been done. First, they sent out a email after scouting some of the Dalai Lama's staff members. They sent out an email to the staffer that appeared to be from a source that he would pay attention to, with an attachment of a document that was directly relevant to his affairs. The attachment is a translation of the Freedom Movement ID book for Tibetans. He opened that, and that was the end of the story for the Dalai Lama's office, because once that had been, done, they were able to begin the process. They installed malware which hooked up to servers, control servers in mostly on Hainan Island in China. Those servers began downloading information out of the computer of the individual and then out of the network. And they did this essentially by installing something called Ghost Rat. I think it's administrative software that is essentially spy scriptware. And it allows you, among other things, to log all the keystrokes of anybody on the network, to turn on the webcam, and to turn on the mic. This is the full 1984 nightmare, only worse because you had to buy the webcam. And it happened over and over again. Happened to the entire Dalai Lama network, but not just to them. Here are the people who were victims, known victims of this attack, which allowed administrative privileges on all of the networks of some of these agencies. And I thought it was quite significant. Some of these are very sophisticated organizations: Associated Press, Deloitte and Touche. Anybody here buying security services from Deloitte and Touche? The Software Technology Parks of India, the Indian Embassy to the United States, the Venezuelan telephone network, and on, the Vietnam Petroleum Exploration Company, which means that if they find anything, they're going to share that with others. Yes. So we put that in last. The prospect that this can be done to those sorts of sophisticated organizations on such a scale really raises the prospect that all of our network tools will be used against us. This is, in essence, what the people who've been arguing for a cybersecurity initiative for 3 presidents now have been saying. And what I would note is that the contribution of the privacy community, by and large, to that effort has been to say, now don't do too much. Let's make sure you don't actually tell the private sector to do anything. In fact, we don't really want you to talk to the private sector. And NSA, what the hell are they involved in this for? I mean, isn't this going to mean another closet in some central office someplace that does who knows what? The mistrust is focused entirely on the people who are trying to do the defense, as opposed to the massive intrusions and attacks that we're now seeing. Nothing that we're currently doing with any of these cybersecurity initiatives gives any promise of ending the kinds of intrusions that we're seeing here, or of restricting the ability of attackers to develop new attacks that will be worse. And I think there's very few people here, especially in the age of social media, who has not released enough information that you could plausibly produce an email that could be sent to you that you would open the attachment of. And once you've done that, unless you have a system that does not have any zero-day exploits in it, you're toast. This is a very troubling development, and one that I think privacy organizations should be spending their time on, rather than focusing on the idea that the worst threat is that somehow NSA will lend its expertise to the effort. Thanks.
Thank you, Stewart. Our next speaker is Jim Harper. Jim Harper is the Director of Information Policy at the Cato Institute, and he's the author of the book Identity Crisis: How Identification is Overused and Misunderstood. Harper focuses on the difficult problems of adapting law and policy to the unique problems of the information age. He's also a member of the Homeland Security's Data Privacy and Integrity Advisory Committee, and his work has been cited by the USA Today, the Associated Press, and Reuters. Jim Harper also once flew from San Francisco to D.C. without identification on a dare, and both he and the nation lived to see another day.
He did it in 1972.
I was too young to fly back then. I wasn't born, I'd like to say, but that's not true. We're going to have a wide-ranging discussion today, obviously, and an interesting one, good for CFP, I think. I'm going to focus more on the national security issues than cybersecurity, and sweep right past the implied tension in the title of our panel between security and privacy. Because whether on the merits there is tension between security and privacy, I think that the specter of terrorism has put the two into tension for political purposes and for public policy purposes. So rather than talk about privacy so much, I want to talk about terrorism some. In 4 years that I've been on the DHS Privacy Committee, I've realized that you really can't have a sensible conversation about privacy, and frankly you can't balance privacy and security, while terrorism is misunderstood. And so I've been spending a lot of time on terrorism and counterterrorism over the last year or so, and I want to share a little bit about that with a sort of long view. How is terrorism doing these days? I think it's fair to say terrorism has had a pretty good decade, but we are starting to turn things back, and the country is starting to turn things back. I think the lagging indicator may be the politicians and the folks that we call our leaders. Let me point you to a couple of resources online that might be helpful to you. We had a conference in January at Cato, just the week before the new administration came in, on counterterrorism and counterterrorism strategy. And we brought 30-plus nationally recognized experts on terrorism to talk about terrorism, talk about that problem. You can find it at cato.org/counterterrorism. And in addition, concurrently on Cato's online magazine, Cato Unbound, we held a discussion about how to communicate about terrorism. That was called Keep Calm and Carry On. Cato Unbound is at cato-unbound.org. And the January meeting had a number of communications experts and terrorism experts to work on this problem of terrorism. At the conference, we dug into the issues that are so dominate the discussion in public and in the press. We looked at the capability of Al-Qaeda and other terror networks, to the extent there are. It's clearly on the wane to the experts that study them carefully. The viability of various so-called WMD attacks, the fact that they're easy to do and that bad guys have a lot of capability to do them is taken as a given, but it's not necessarily the case. Although that doesn't mean we ever have to sort of walk away and pretend like it's an impossibility. How do we organize and rationalize domestic security? Obviously the federal government has taken a huge role, but just like all politics, all terror attacks are going to be local, and they're responsibly local as well. So moving away from federal control of domestic security is probably better. What motivates terrorists? People who actually study terrorists. Not people here in D.C. who impute motives to terrorists from their actions, which is a mistake, or impute the reasons why to terrorists based on their actions, which is a mistake. People who actually watch terrorists and interview them and talk to them and study them statistically. And it's really interesting that their motivations blend together, of course, but they can be broken down into three: goals, grievances, and gang memberships. I think there may be a few that have huge worldwide geopolitical goals. More often than not, those are stated, because stating huge goals is a terrorist tactic. Grievances. A guy named Robert Pape at the University of Chicago has a great study showing that the number one motivator of suicide terrorism is occupation of prized lands. And so those local grievances tend to be what drive terrorism, at least in the suicide terrorism context. Gang membership is the most interesting element and maybe the newest, least understood. A lot of terrorists become terrorists to be terrorists. They don't have a strategic motivation. They'll mouth whatever goals that their groups have, purportedly, but they're more in it to be in it. It's like gang membership. If you're just a two-bit hood, you're just a two-bit hood. But join the Bloods or the Crips, and all of a sudden you're badass. Likewise, around the world, people who oppose the U.S. and U.S. power can oppose U.S. power, but doing that on their own is not that big a deal. If they can associate themselves with Al-Qaeda, well, then they're badass. I think there's an emerging strategic understanding of terrorism, that terrorism seeks overreaction. Terrorists are weak actors who try to get strong actors like the United States and Western countries to overreact and do the work for them. So waste of blood and treasure. When the United States goes to war, for example, for purposes we realize now were mistaken, that wastes our blood and treasure. That wastes trillions of dollars, perhaps, thousands and thousands of lives, our own and Iraqi and other. Our overreactions bring recruiting and sympathy gains to terrorists, and we see that terrorism is motivated by some of the responses that the U.S. has taken to the 9/11 attacks. And it provides us, I think, the most interesting and new insight, which is not new to Michael German from the ACLU, who will be moderating a panel tomorrow. The terrorists have an ideological story that they tell themselves and that they tell others. And overreaction on the part of victim states like the United States tends to confirm the ideological narrative of terrorists. What does that prescribe for us in terms of counterterrorism strategy? Well, obviously to avoid overreaction, by not going to war, by not killing people who shouldn't be killed, and by not confirming that terrorist narrative that the United States is an evil power. Meticulous good behavior on the part of victim states is good strategic counterterrorism. And by that I include according civil rights and civil liberties to the people of the country attacked, and according civil rights and civil liberties to alleged terrorists. Not because it's nice or moral or constitutional, though those are all important, but because it's good strategic counterterrorism. Most important, I think, and least realized is that American leaders and Western leaders have to avoid exalting terrorism and avoid exalting terrorists. When the prior administration talked about a war on terror, that gave legitimacy in the eyes of ideological and physical neighbors of terrorists to those terrorists. And we made more important on the world stage some terrorists who we should have allowed to shrink away as evildoers, true evildoers. But instead we've held terrorist leaders up to world acclaim among opponents of U.S. power. The goal of security is both actual security and the feeling of security. This is something that Bruce Schneier has talked about a great deal. And we have succeeded to quite a degree in the first part of security, which is actual security, but we've yet to succeed with the feeling of security. We're not better off in a 9/12 environment where we're all huddled together crying. We want to be a free country that's bold, that feels free, that knows we have a place in the world and we're welcome in the world. So I'm cautiously optimistic about the Obama administration, particularly in terms of rhetoric. Eschewing the war on terror language, I think, is very helpful, and it starts to walk the country back from unfortunate overreactions in the prior administration. Though President Obama is not immune to overstatement, I think on Friday his statement about cyber terror attacks was a little silly, and coming up with the phrase, or using the phrase, weapons of mass disruption is a little bit cartoonish. Cybersecurity is important, and it's important for the government to secure its networks. It's important for private sector to secure its networks and assets. But weapons of mass disruption is not a helpful mean to add to the debate. More importantly than the rhetoric, though, is the substance. And on that, the Obama administration has yet to show real progress. I think it's fair to say, and just briefly, that presidents and executive branches don't give up power that their predecessors acquired. So don't think that because you like President Obama on a number of reasons that he's going to give away the power that the Bush administration tried to bring to the executive branch of the government. We have to take that power back, and hopefully in a better, more sensible terrorism environment, all of us can on the political stage, courts can as well. So I think the prognosis is good, but we won't quickly come back into balance in terms of privacy and security. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. Our next speaker is Valerie Caproni. Since 2003, Valerie Caproni has served as the General Counsel for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Her responsibilities include dealing with national security wiretaps, responding to court challenges to the FBI's expanded powers through the Patriot Act, and ensuring that agents do not break the law as they conduct anti-terrorism investigations. Before that, Ms. Caproni worked as the Regional Director for California at the SEC and spent a number of years working in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of New York, prosecuting the mob and drug dealers.
Thanks. Good morning, everybody. Needless to say, as the General Counsel of the FBI, I reject the notion that we can have privacy or we can have security, but we can't have both. What we need is a balance. And the notion of balancing privacy and security is not really a new concept. It's been with us for forever, really. But for this morning, for my 5 minutes of just talking, what I'd like to do is focus on 3 issues that the moderator thought this group in particular might be interested in, where I suspect more than 50% of this crowd thinks that the FBI and the United States government generally has gotten that balance wrong. And I'm going to go on the fool's errand of trying to persuade you that, in fact, we have the balance right. And the 3 issues are national security letters, which seem to have become a total bugaboo, the new FISA law, and the new Attorney General guidelines that were adopted last December, or last October, I guess. National security letters and our use of the national security letters got a tremendous amount of press a couple of years ago when the Department of Justice Inspector General issued a critical report on NSLs. Let me presage what will be coming in another couple of months, which is that there's another IG report coming out that will again sort of address national security letters. It's actually the use of one unit at headquarters use of what they called exigent letters to get certain telephone records. It will come as no surprise to you that that report will be extremely critical of the FBI, and specifically of the management controls or the lack of management controls that were in place. But just to get my defense out here before the report, all that conduct took place prior to 2006 and was prior to our implementing new internal controls. But let me talk about what the NSL report found and what it didn't find. I think he found, and this got a lot of press, that we really didn't live up to the standards that we expect of the FBI in the use of this tool. And I wish I could have quarreled with him or said he didn't have the facts right, but I really couldn't, because he did. We had some lapses in internal controls, specifically with regard to this unit at headquarters and the use of exigent letters, and we were also not as careful as we would like our agents to be in the preparation of the paperwork that associates with national security letters. On the other hand, and this I think sort of got lost in the shuffle, the true error rate when the use of national security letters was actually fairly low. It was about 3%. Now, that's not to say that that's acceptable. Thank you. It's not. But it wasn't the sort of massive abuse of the tool that one might have thought if you just read the headlines in the newspaper. But we've addressed those issues. It's taken a long time. We've instituted a tremendous amount of training. We've consolidated all of the advice in one place so it's easy to follow. We have a web-based system to get rid of a lot of the paperwork errors that our agents were committing. But I think for today's topic, what's really important to remember is that even in that report, even from the Department of Justice Inspector General, he concludes that the national security letter is an important tool for the FBI in conducting national security investigations that are designed to keep the country safe. We need NSLs to get the basic building blocks of an investigation. And while people get nervous about the notion of the Bureau having telephone records, everybody needs to keep in mind that what we can get with a national security letter is not the content of conversations or of emails, but of simply who's in contact with whom, the length of the call, the date of the call, the time of the call, that sort of information, which is, from our perspective, incredibly valuable in building a case in order to determine fairly quickly whether the person that we're looking at is a terrorist or is a spy. That is someone that we should engage in further investigation. And I would also note that this is the sort of records, again, for all of the angst that came with national security letters and with the change that the Patriot Act brought in terms of the standard that we have to use. These records, telephone records and financial records, are the sort of records that assistant U.S. attorneys get every day in the course of normal criminal investigations without a huge hue and cry. It's the same privacy implications, and yet for whatever reason there doesn't seem to be the same concern about a criminal investigator getting these records. Same records. And in fact, a national security letter is in some ways more privacy protective. And the reason they're more privacy protective is because they come with them, what comes with a national security letter is an obligation of secrecy. So within the bank and within the phone company or within the whatever entity we're serving the national security letter on, it's not all of the paralegals in the subpoena compliance area who can have access to it. It's a very small group of people who will know that we even obtained the records of a particular customer. So that's national security letters. I'm hoping I've persuaded at least one or two people here that we actually need them and that they're a good thing. The second issue that I'd like to talk about quickly are the new Attorney General guidelines that went into effect. Last fall, when the Attorney General announced that he was going to give us new Attorney General guidelines, it was interesting that the two probably most liberal newspapers, or two most major liberal newspapers in the country, the New York Times and the Washington Post, ran absolutely diametrically opposed editorials on the guidelines. The New York Times came out opposed to them. They thought they were a substantial intrusion into privacy and civil liberties interest. The Washington Post came out in favor of the guidelines. So I would say if those two newspapers can come out diametrically opposed, it's at least worth thinking about whether these actually are a good thing. I will argue that the New York Times got this wrong. They actually had not seen the guidelines when they wrote the editorial, but that's, just FYI. Prior to the consolidation, and that's what the Attorney General was doing, was consolidating our criminal guidelines and our national security guidelines into one set. There were very odd differences between the two sets of guidelines that were not particularly sensible from a policy perspective, and they were very difficult to explain to our workforce. For example, under the criminal guidelines, there were no limits on tasking a confidential human source outside of a predicated case. So let's say we were trying to quickly resolve a lead. You could ask a human source to, say, go into the bar to find out if they're dealing drugs in there. But it was not permitted in a national security investigation unless you actually had an investigation open. Under the criminal guidelines, there were no limits on physical surveillance where you weren't intruding in a constitutionally protected right of privacy. So a criminal agent, during the course of following a lead that had something to do with a criminal matter, could watch a place or a person, as long as they weren't, again, intruding into an area where there was a constitutionally protected interest. You couldn't do that under the national security guidelines, but you could engage in what was called casual observation. And let me tell you, it was something close to a Talmudic exercise to explain what's the difference between casual observation and physical surveillance. So what the Attorney General did was he combined them and he got rid of the inconsistencies between the two sets of rules. And I will tell you that these inconsistencies, in addition to not making sense from a policy perspective, from a overarching perspective, it was total happenstance, or it could be total happenstance, which set of rules the agent was obligated to follow. So if you think about the case that was down in North Carolina about 10 years ago, where there was a group of people who were raising money for Hezbollah by selling untaxed cigarettes. If that case was opened as a Hezbollah case, then you had to comply with the national security guidelines. If it was opened as a sale of untaxed cigarettes where they just happened to be laundering the money for the benefit of Hezbollah, then it was a criminal case and it was governed by the criminal guidelines. So there was an opportunity for abuse by playing the system to get the set of guidelines that you wanted. And again, as a policy perspective, it didn't make a lot of sense, either from a privacy perspective, a civil liberties perspective, or just good common sense, to have harsher and more difficult rules that governed our agents on the national security side than on the criminal side. It is my view that the guidelines provide a graduated approach so that the more intrusive techniques can be used only if there's more substantial predication. So the more we know about somebody that suggests they're engaged in criminal conduct, terror conduct, or they're an agent of a foreign power in some way, the more intrusive tools that we can use. But I think most important, the Attorney General guidelines require in our internal manual, which we're going to try to release as much as possible, and that should happen pretty soon, require that the predication for an investigation, so kind of the access into these more intrusive tools, cannot be based solely on the exercise of First Amendment rights, race or ethnicity, or some combination of those three. So we think we ultimately are protecting the civil liberties of Americans, but we're doing it in a way that is more rational. I've just seen my stop sign, but let me just say, as to FISA and the new FISA bill, what the new FISA bill did was make FISA technology neutral, and at the same time that it did that, it actually enhanced privacy protection for U.S. persons. So now we, NSA, whoever, needs a court order anytime we're engaging in electronic surveillance of a U.S. person, regardless of whether they're in the United States or outside the United States. But what we no longer need is a court order to engage in electronic surveillance of two people outside the United States, neither of whom are a U.S. person, who are communicating with each other. Never made any sense to me why we wanted a U.S. court involved in that transaction in any event.
Thank you. Next up is Bruce Schneier. Bruce Schneier is an internationally renowned security technologist, author, and a former columnist for Wired.com. His current book, Schneier on Security, offers insight into everything from the risk of identity theft, which is vastly overrated, to the long-range security threat of unchecked presidential power. He's the founder and chief technical officer of Counterpane Internet Security, and he designed the popular Blowfish encryption algorithm, has written 9 books, including Applied Cryptography. He also writes the free email newsletter Cryptogram and blogs at Schneier.com.
So it's interesting, actually, up here. Stewart's twittering from the stage, and Jim has somebody at Cato who's posting footnotes as he speaks. I'm really feeling kind of lame here. I do want to give actually one reference to something Jim says, an essay I wrote, you can Google it, it's called 7 Habits of Highly Ineffectual Terrorists. And it talks about the motivations behind terrorists, and I think it echoes a lot of what Jim says. So if someone could just Twitter that up there, I'd appreciate it.
I'll have my people get on that.
Thanks. So you know, at panels like these, I tend to be the meta guy. And what I want to talk about is, you know, how to think about security versus privacy, since it is a dichotomy we've heard a lot since September 11th. The Economist had an essay contest some years ago on security versus privacy, and that was the topic. I think it's very much a false dichotomy, and I think it's bad policy to really set the debate on that topic. That security versus privacy assumes that you either get one or the other, or you're trying to balance A or B. And only some types of security affect privacy. I mean, really only, in the main, identity-based security hurts privacy. And, you know, a lot of people have written about limitations to that approach, to identity-based security. I mean, some places it's valuable, some places it isn't. In airline security, I think there have been exactly 2 things we've done since September 11th to improve the security of airlines. And the first one is reinforcing the cockpit door, and the second one is convincing passengers they have to fight back. And those 2 things have absolutely nothing to do with privacy. Right? So you can compare an ID card with a door lock, you know, a burglar alarm. with many different security devices that don't affect privacy at all. I remember a bunch of years ago, as I was on, I guess people in D.C. know it, was on the Diane Rehm show, and I was talking to someone from DHS about security and privacy and a lot of these topics, and this DHS officer said, when you're on an airplane, you want to know the identity of the guy sitting next to you. And I said, well, no, you don't. Right? You want to know if he's going to blow up the airplane. And if he's not going to blow up the airplane, I don't care who he is. And if he is going to blow up the airplane, I don't care who he is either. Right? I just don't want him to blow up the airplane. So, it doesn't follow that identity is required for security. It doesn't follow that you need to give up privacy to get security. In the last panel, there was that little discussion about the township that's scanning license plates of everybody who comes through. And you can frame that as a security versus privacy debate. But you can also frame it as is it an effective use of security dollars debate? I mean, yes, if you did something draconian like scan every license plate or search everybody or, jail every third person who walked through the door, you would catch some criminals. But is that an effective use of your security dollar? Is that an effective use of the liberties and freedoms you're giving up? So it doesn't have to be security versus privacy, it's security versus security. So if you're scanning everyone's license plate, and yes, you'll catch some bad people, but how many bad things will be created by the database? What sorts of abuses will occur because you're doing this? What things aren't you doing? All the policemen who are doing this work, what aren't they doing? What are the false positives? What are the false negatives? Lots of ways you can look at this that isn't security versus privacy. So, I do agree with Valerie that there's a balance here, but security versus privacy is the wrong way to frame it. The balance is fundamentally liberty versus control. And that's the way to think of these issues. It's a liberty versus control debate. And this also explains some of the problems you get when you look at security versus privacy. Because there's a common notion that in the new world, there'll be more openness, but it'll be fair. So I know your secrets, you know my secrets, and, so what? It's different, but it's still fair. But when you look at that in the liberty versus control frame, it doesn't make sense. Right? Because if you sort of think about it, openness in government, open government laws foster liberty. But forced openness in the people, that fosters control. So what's missing is the power imbalance. Right? What openness does is reduces power. What privacy does is increases power. So if you have people at relatively the same level of power, then making the change, doesn't change relative power levels. But if you have government versus the people, right, then reducing privacy in government, open government laws, reduces government power with respect to the people. Right? That makes us more equal. That's a good thing. Now, increased privacy to the people increases personal power. Again, reduces the differential. That's a good thing. Right? This is why you'll see totalitarian regimes being against open government and against personal privacy. They're trying to increase the power between the government and the people. Right? So the power imbalance is key. Right? When a policeman asks you to see your ID and you ask to see his, that doesn't make it better. Right? That doesn't make it the same. You walk into your doctor and your doctor says, take off your clothes. You can't say, well, you first, doc. Right? Fundamentally, that exchange doesn't happen. And that's the power imbalance. So this mutual disclosure idea doesn't really work unless you have people of equal power. So fundamentally, security is liberty plus privacy. Right? Privacy is a part of security. Now, there are times when security and privacy are in opposition. We know that's true, lots of places. There are all sorts of places where we give up privacy to get security. Police investigations, sharing of medical information, identification in a corporate setting, banking, all these good reasons. And what we do, the way we as society maintain security when we have to give up privacy is through oversight. Right? That's the mechanism we use, whether it's executive, legislative, judicial. Right? The idea that mean, the whole warrant process, I mean, already without any more laws, the police are allowed to intrude on the most intimate aspects of our life. And that's okay. Right? We're happy with that. We are safer because of that. But we build in a warrant system that requires the police to go to a neutral third party and say, hey, there's a good reason for me to do this. There's oversight, there's redress, there's mechanisms in place to ensure that the people we entrust this invasiveness to don't abuse it. And that's how we maintain security, even though we might give up privacy. So these are some ways to think about it. I want to leave sort of one more metaphor I've been working with the past couple of years. The notion of data as pollution. That fundamentally, I think data is the pollution problem of the information age. If you think about it, all processes produce it sort of naturally, and it stays around. And what really we're debating mostly is its secondary uses, right? How we store it, how we dispose of it, how we recycle it. And it's interesting, and I think just as sort of we look back 100 years ago at the industrial age and sort of wonder how the titans that built it could ignore the industrial pollution, that our grandchildren will look back at us and the decisions we make on how we deal with information pollution. And I think it's a good way to think about it, because these problems aren't going to go away. And I think Stewart's right, they're getting worse.
Thanks, Bruce. So I wanted to start with a question based on about cybersecurity and how privacy and security are balanced there. In a New Yorker story from January 2008, they told a story of the genesis of the federal government's current obsession with cybersecurity. And in that, there was an anecdote that Michael McConnell told President Bush that if the 9/11 terrorists had instead decided to launch a targeted cyber attack against a U.S. bank, that the financial economic damage to the country would have been an order of magnitude larger than the attacks of 9/11. Ed Giorgio, one of McConnell's top advisors, told the New Yorker, "We have a saying in this business, privacy and security are a zero-sum game." But just the other day, I got an email with the subject line, "Privacy and security guaranteed." And that was from a Canadian pharmacy that was asking me to buy prescription drugs online. So the question is, what is the relationship between security and privacy, especially when it comes to cybersecurity, and is it different for the government as opposed to citizens?
I think that raises a point that I think is important, and it's a point that I thought was missing actually from President Obama's remarks and from what I was able to get to in the cybersecurity 60-day review. True critical infrastructure should not touch the public internet, or be absolutely limited from touching the public internet. And I see an unfortunate trend among our political leaders, President Obama, Jay Rockefeller, the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, to push critical infrastructures onto the public internet and then bring the government in behind to secure the public internet. Much better, much wiser, I think, to keep true critical infrastructure off the public internet. And my colleague Tim Lee at Cato Adjunct there, also at Princeton University, he's written well about how, for example, the cyber attack on Estonia was not as big as people thought. Reporters said that financial services and ministries went down, when in fact it was websites of financial services and ministries. And these critical infrastructures should be kept off the internet. That should be the premier government policy, is to keep critical infrastructure off the internet, not to push it onto the internet and then take that as a reason why the government should have a big piece of it. Oh, and briefly, I'll respond to one of the tweets that was very welcome. They're interesting. TechZar1 pointed out, I think in response to my dichotomy between cybersecurity and national security, he said that cybersecurity is national security. Some cybersecurity is national security, but most cybersecurity is just cybersecurity.
So I think we just heard Cato announce its support for the most massive regulatory program that the United States has ever entered into, in which we are going to forbid...
Cato scholars always speak individually, and never for the institution.
I beg your pardon.
We'll be interested in
the
Steptoe and Johnson's
tweet.
views on things.
But to say, we're going to tell people, your critical infrastructure, you got to get off the net, is a massive change in how we're organizing our economy.
Stewart, it's just silly to take that. I didn't say there should be a public regulatory policy. The government should say, just like I'm saying.
Oh, just say, get your stuff off the internet.
Yeah. So go on with substance, not twisting what I just said.
If they say, well, I don't choose to, I'm saving money here, I heard Ryan, he said, oh, the government just has an obsession with cybersecurity. You're not that worried about cybersecurity. You evidently don't care what
Financial services providers, anybody...
Electric power
yes,
providers.
They should lose a lot of money if they fail to secure themselves.
But you know, this is... The risk that they're taking of losing money is a relatively small risk, and they don't have a very good idea how to protect themselves. They've got customers who want to use their services. Are they supposed to not respond to emails?
The government has no better idea how to protect them.
I'm not suggesting the government has an idea for the best regulatory approach, because it's easy to say there are obviously problems in terms of economic incentives to get on the internet and not worry too much about security. We can all agree that there might be problems in that regard. But then trying to say, okay, so what should people do to protect themselves? If we knew what to do to protect ourselves, Deloitte and Touche would have done it already. But obviously we have yet to figure out the best way to address these security problems. I do think that we need to look at the question of how do we do better attribution on the internet, and the question of whether we can really afford to have substantial amounts of financial and other transactions occurring in a context where we can't actually verify who sent me an email, for example. That's going to raise significant architectural problems, but I think it's probably part of the solution.
That's Steptoe and Johnson announcing their plan to require everybody to identify themselves before using the internet.
Let's all calm down, people. So, I mean, critical infrastructure tends to sneak up on us. You know, when I started using the internet, we were trading Star Trek pictures. And, you know, it was all kind of by accident that it became critical. You know, and now when I go home, I know that my physical mail will be irrelevant because it was important I'd get it on email. Right? That change wasn't planned, that wasn't programmed. So I don't think it's easy to say get critical infrastructure off the internet, because nobody knows what's critical until it's critical. And then it's too late. And I think we're going to always have to live with critical infrastructure on the internet. When is Facebook critical infrastructure? Is it going to be next year or the year after? There probably is going to be a time where some social networking site is viewed as critical because of what it does. And here we are, right, blindly ignoring the fact. Because that's what we do. That makes sense. So, you know, to me, the internet will always be used for critical things, simply because we're moving all of our socialization, whether business or personal, onto the internet. It's a new medium to do the old things. And in these ways, I mean, the answers to the questions are the same as they were in the real world. I mean, the way you deal with personal identifying information on the internet, if it's needed by law enforcement, by whoever needs it, is through oversight. And I think that goes true for governments, that goes true for corporations, that without oversight, you don't know what's happening, you know what's going on. So, you know, it'll be the typical data hygiene things we've heard all the time. Data minimization, right? Informed consent over secondary use. Audit and controls to deal with the inevitable abuses. Right? And this is how you maintain security when you're giving up privacy on the net or elsewhere. I mean, the net isn't a magically new place. It's the old place, except with Twitter.
Going to wait for your returns now.
I had initially said to Jim that I was not going to jump into this, but when the hypothetical question or the question was asked, when is Facebook going to become critical infrastructure, it already is to 13-year-old girls. And let's hope it never becomes for the country.
There'll be a time when 13-year-old girls are running the country. I mean, sooner or later, some U.S. president is going to send a lolcat to a Soviet leader. I mean, this will happen. And we better be prepared for it.
Mike has news.
So this question, I'm going to start with you, Bruce, but I think everyone's going to want to have a shot at it. But you were a fierce critic of warrantless wiretapping, biometric fingerprint programs at the border, the liquid ban on airplanes. But the Bush administration used these tactics and powers under the Patriot Act, and there was not a single foreign terrorist attack since 9/11 in the country. Maybe doesn't that show that these programs are just part of a smart, layered approach to security?
So we call this like a red herring question, or so there are sort of two answers. I mean, it demonstrates one of two things, right? It demonstrates that these measures were effective, or it demonstrates that terrorist attacks are very, very rare, and there's no way to measure. I mean, there hasn't been any meteor strikes in the past 8 years either. So maybe warrantless eavesdropping protects against that. I remember it was like 2004. Maybe, and then Attorney General John Ashcroft came to my hometown, Minneapolis, and he gave a speech. And he said basically that, it's been a few years, and he used the number, say 3 years, since September 11th, and there have been no terrorist attacks, and that's proof my policies are working. And I'm sitting and I'm listening, and I'm thinking, well, there were no terrorist attacks in the 3 years before 9/11. You didn't have any policies. Well, what does that prove? Right? It proves that attacks are rare. And this is sort of a fundamental problem in discussing security countermeasures for rare events. If we had a crime rate in the city and we instituted some security measure, low jack on cars or something, and the crime rate went down or it didn't, you can measure the efficacy of the security measure, and you can look at the cost and look at the benefits and see if it's worth it. But if you're dealing with a very, very rare event, you don't have enough data to produce evidence one way or the other whether the measures were working. I look at the terrorist plots foiled, with the most recent one was a couple of weeks ago, and they seem kind of laughable. And I wonder whether they were actual terrorist plots. I wonder about entrapment. I wonder about whether informants created terrorists where there weren't any. That some of them are just so fanciful and so diluted. And often the targets and the tactics are suggested by the informant or the FBI, the agent. And I don't know of details to make any assessment of any particular incident, but the stuff I read is worrisome. I mean, the latest one about the synagogue bombings. I mean, these guys were kind of nutcases, and it seemed pretty clear to me that without an FBI agent giving them fake weapons, they would just, be sitting stoned in the back room of a restaurant still talking about it. Now, it's nice to get these people off the streets, but to me this isn't an example of our security measures have kept us safe. It's an example of something else. So it's very hard to look at the data simply because there isn't enough data, which means we're really stuck doing analysis of hypotheticals, an analysis from a security perspective of the pluses and minuses. But it's not like the murder rate in the city where you can add 1,000 policemen and see the change in 6 months, and maybe even say that change is a result of that. It just makes it harder.
I think I disagree with Bruce on the philosophy, on the meta stuff, but maybe also on the facts, because there have been a couple of attacks planned against the United States that almost certainly had central al-Qaeda participation in the planning. And the ones that I'm particularly familiar with are attacks that were designed to blow up airplanes in mid-flight that were bound from Europe to the United States. There was the Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, and then a much more ambitious plot to blow up as many as a dozen planes with liquids, a plot we all remember every time we got on a plane these days. What I thought was significant is those are the two plots where you can really identify an effort to hit the United States. And what's significant about them is that neither of them were designed to try to test our border defenses or to organize something successful inside the United States, because that was hard. And it was easier to organize this and then execute it in a fashion that would be viewed as an attack on the United States without actually dealing with the various improved measures that we've put in place at many points in the United States. I think that does tell you that this has had an effect. Now, Which exactly security measures could you get rid of and still be safe? That is an unknowable thing. You certainly can't judge whether the security measures are inadequate by whether the plot sounds unlikely, because, of course, on August 1, 2001, if the guys who flew into the World Trade Center had been busted, or some of them, we'd be sitting around saying, oh, what a bunch of bozos. They couldn't even graduate from flight school in some cases. How likely is it that they were actually going to be able to pull this off? And so, you know, these things sound unlikely until they happen, and then they sound inevitable, and everyone goes back and says, how come we didn't know more about this? And those are reasonable questions that folks have asked. The same thing, I think, is true about the question of how much internal FBI and other law enforcement intrusion and participation in faux plots are we willing to tolerate or accept. You know, one of the enormously valuable byproducts of what happened in some of these plots, where you might say, I'm not sure these guys were capable themselves of doing this, is that you reduce the amount of trust among people who might conspire to commit terrorist acts. Everybody's aware that there's a problem with self-radicalization, small groups, lost boy radicalization. I think that we heard about that from Jim Harper. And you want them to worry that when they start running into other people who voice the same opinions and want to actually do something, that they might be being set up. Sowing mistrust among terrorist groups is a good thing, and if it means that we have to have a few plots where a few people who want to do it but aren't that good at it end up prosecuted, I think that's a price that's worth paying.
So I'll disagree with both of my my discussants. The question doesn't present a red herring, as Bruce suggested. It presents the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, which is that because something followed in time, it was causally related. So the policies that were put in place after 9/11 were not what prevented future attacks from happening. It was certainly the possibility that attacks are very rare, but also the fact that people around the world, and especially in the United States, people and agencies in the United States were highly, highly motivated to watch out for terrorist attacks. I don't know that there's any policy put in place after 9/11 that was more related to stopping terrorism than the practice of looking out for terrorism on the part of both individuals and agencies. And that's why the Richard Reed shoe bomb attack failed, is because partially because he was a numbskull, but partially because the person sitting next to him said, that's not ordinary behavior on a flight, and really, really bad things can happen if I let that go on. John Mueller at Ohio State University has done wonderful tracking of statements by public officials about the merits of the policies that they put in place. And some of I think the worst of it is when they say, we haven't seen an attack over the last X years, and that's proof that one is coming soon. Those are actual statements from some prominent people, and my memory isn't perfect, so I won't say it was a particular FBI director, but there might have been an FBI director that...
Someone will tweet it for him.
Please tweet, if you will, Dr. Mueller, if you're watching. Right. But but it is very difficult, and I think I take something of a middle ground on the question whether they are just nincompoops or whether they're serious. Maybe a middle ground between Stewart and Bruce. I'm persuaded that nincompoops can be activated by a non-nincompoop. Take the muscle on 9/11 with Mohammed Atta leading them. They turned into something, and so it is, I think, very important not to entirely dismiss the Fort Dix folks and that silly plot. You got to admit the JFK plot was silly, right? Okay. Yeah. Those seem really silly until somebody comes along and gets them. So I think pressuring those people in ways that Stewart alluded to is important to do. So center ground on that.
And I think I'm probably at neither end of this debate either. I think it's very much in the middle. It's the unknowable. Which things that we have done has contributed to security. I mean, we can certainly say that from surveillance we've detected plots and disrupted them, and the plot to blow up planes over the Atlantic are certainly one notable example of that. There's no question that those people were motivated. There's no question that they would have moved forward and done it. Having said that, We also are incredibly sensitive to the issue of entrapment. Entrapment will get litigated in all of these cases where you're going to have a judge of the oversight, the neutral oversight that is in fact critical to our system of justice. There's been no acquittals for nincompoops on the grounds of entrapment since 9/11. And people do get entrapped. There's no question it happens certainly in drug cases from time to time, but we haven't seen it in any of these cases. And I have to agree with Jim. It's like, you know, it's easy in the security of this room to say those people were engaged in just crazy talk. But crazy talk sometimes results in people coming together and doing crazy things that get people killed. So at least from the standpoint of the FBI, we're not in a position to just ignore it on the grounds that it's too wacky for us to pursue. I don't think, you know, that would be great and everybody would be in favor of us just watching these people until we lose them on surveillance and then they then go and blow up a synagogue. So from the standpoint of the Bureau, we have to look at these people. We have to look at them carefully. We certainly spend a lot of time with our agents telling them where are the lines in terms of what constitutes entrapment and what's okay. And so far, thank goodness, we haven't yet had a court disagree with us in terms of where that line was drawn.
Thank you. I would now like to turn to audience questions, and we'll try to keep your questions short, and also panelists, keep your answers short. We're getting close on time.
Hi there. So this is a question for Valerie. Wiretaps get the most attention in terms of surveillance technologies, but the one that I'm interested in is pen registers and trap and trace devices. So the law requires that Justice submit stats every year to Congress. In 2004, 5 years worth of stats were submitted at once, and we haven't seen any statistics since then regarding the use of these two tools. The FBI makes up about 50% of all of these trap and traces and pen registers. So the first question is, are you submitting the stats to DOJ? And the second question is, do you know if DOJ is submitting the stats for all of federal law enforcement to Congress?
I believe we do submit the stats, but I confess I don't know. In fact, that doesn't come out of OGC because we're not the ones that count them. But if we're obligated to submit the stats, I'm confident that we do. And I'm not sure why DOJ accumulated 5 years and reported them all at once. I have no idea.
Thank you.
Al Milliken, AM Media. How many of you have visited and studied any of the Islamist and jihadist websites that both promote and advocate Islam, but also terrorism, and are involved in recruiting and sharing ways to practice and spread terror? How effective have these been in serving their purposes?
I haven't studied them directly, but I recommend Mark Sageman, the work of Mark Sageman too. He's got a book called Leaderless Jihad, and he's there's a segment of our counterterrorism conference in January where he speaks, and it's very, very interesting to hear from someone who actually follows the jihadi websites and interviews jihadis when he can. He characterizes, I don't think I can do him justice, but he characterizes some sort of stages in Islamist terrorism. And the current stage is really sort of Terminator wannabes. A lot of, particularly in Europe, not so much the Middle East, but in Europe, and to the extent there are any in the United States. These are kids with not much to do. They're a little bit excluded from the labor market, and they're a little bit helped along by welfare payments, and have little else to do but to talk to other kids online and become wannabe jihadis. It's a very interesting, again, I don't do him justice. He's a very interesting man, and his book Leaderless Jihad is a very interesting read.
Anybody else?
So I'm Paul Severson from the Naval Research Laboratory. I wanted to preface my remarks by noting that at this conference in, I think, 1999 and again in 2002, on panels I suggested that anytime somebody requests that you consider the contrast between security versus privacy, that you should just automatically reject the dichotomy and then go from there. And so I'd like to take this panel's existence as a testimony to the effect I've had on the community. But
yeah, I wish you had the same effect on the ACLU.
Yeah, right. Oh. Well, so the reason I say that is to some extent for some of the things that Bruce has said and some of the things Ann Kabukian said in commentary earlier. But one thing that has not been brought up that I think is worth noting is that A lot of times increasing personal privacy is an increase in security and an increase in national security. And I say this for two reasons. One is because individuals and corporations and such, that their security matters to national security, and their ability to do things privately and without tracking matters to national security. And this is similar to the same debate back during the crypto wars. But also the ability to conduct law enforcement operations, to conduct national security operations is only possible in a context where there's privacy. This isn't some kind of principle thing. This is just a fact of the matter. You cannot have a witness protection program that even exists if people can completely track where everybody is, because that means that your local town cop has been brought inside the security perimeter because he will be able to distinguish somebody who is, you know, a recognized, you know, person in the right list versus somebody who just doesn't fit.
Right. Thanks. Anybody on the panel respond?
You know, I'd love to believe that, and sometimes it's true. I'm just not sure it's always true, and I guess I should take this opportunity to disagree with something that Bruce said. The notion that democratization of technology is going to always be good for us it's a wonderful idea. I would love to believe it, but as you increase the power that people can derive from technologies, you do also create an opportunity for them to use that power in a fashion that is not good for society. And it's not always the right answer to say, well, if we just had a government with less authority over individuals, we'd be better off. And the inclination to believe that Moore's Law is always going to have beneficial social effects strikes me as the sort of illusion that we are all prey to in this room, because we're all geeks at heart. But it's not at all clear to me that it's going to turn out to be true, and I suspect that some of the things that are happening through GhostNet are an example of the ways in which empowering people, it turns out badly.
I agree, and I didn't mean to imply that absolutely uniformly, you know, blindly just this works. What I'm saying is that usually the opposite is asserted without even thinking about the implications, the national security implications of increasing privacy. And people don't even ever recognize that. I'm not saying always, whenever you increase privacy, automatically national security increases. I wasn't trying to imply that at all.
And I don't think the universal either. I mean, to me, I consider this sort of the random noise theory of risk. You sort of imagine that us in society, there's going to be some noise, some bad things happen, right? Some perturbation of normal, and that's crime. And so the worry is, as technology increases, as technology gives individuals more power, the amplitude of the noise increases. You know, sort of the thought experiment of how much damage can 10 armed men do before they're subdued, and run that experiment through the history of society, you know, back from prehistory to now. And the amplitude gets bigger. So, I mean, this is a worry that there is, as individuals get more power, the amount of noise they can add to society increases. And now the question is, when is the noise greater than society itself? And I don't have answers here, but I think that's the right framing of the question.
On that, I think it's important to recognize that the dispersion of technologies give much more power to the society. So it's not the power of society is growing at a I think probably a greater rate than the ability of the noise, or the ability of the bad people to create that noise. It's a very interesting line in Alan Weston's 1967 book Privacy and Freedom, where he says something about, you know, I wonder what could happen if people got access to the kind of computing power that the corporations and governments have. At that point, there was no conception of the personal computer. And so when that computing got dispersed, we got a lot more power as against both governments and corporations.
Hey there, Jeremy Duffy, General Pain in the Butt. Hey Bruce, love your blog. My question is for the govies up there, and it stems from the fact that I understand that government needs a certain amount of power and authority and secrecy to do their job, and their job is to protect us in theory and take care of the people, and that makes a lot of sense. However, I'm highly unwilling to provide them what they need without a fight when I see abuses going on and no accountability for those abuses. For instance, you sit up there today and say either the things that were a problem, they weren't a problem, which, you know, I just can't agree with that, or hey, we only have 3% of the national security letters are abused. Well, if I fail to pay taxes once, there's certainly something that happens. So what are you doing to handle the accountability issues that are going on now and the ones that have taken place in the past, so that you can reassure us that when we grant you that power, you're using it responsibly and therefore deserve to hold that power?
Okay, let me try this. First off, don't misunderstand when I say that there was a 3% error rate. I was not minimizing that or suggesting that that was acceptable. But what I was suggesting is that in a human endeavor, you're going to have mistakes. Those 3% of NSLs that were in error did not involve agents intentionally using a tool to get your phone records when they had no interest in you, or because they wanted your phone records because you're dating their daughter and they didn't really like you. None of that fell into that category. This was, citing the wrong statute, or there's a typographical error in the telephone number so that you actually get the wrong records, something along those lines. Not an acceptable error, but I think you have to take into account the fact that we're humans, and these agents a lot of times are running as fast as they can to try to stay in front of something that is something like people trying to blow up airliners crossing the Atlantic, and we want to find out very quickly whether there's a cell in the United States that's connected. We take actually accountability incredibly seriously. I've been at the Bureau for 6 years, and I will tell you that we punish our employees more than any place I have ever worked. It is unbelievable how much FBI and sort of the disciplinary system for FBI employees, and we take extremely seriously an agent, or a non-agent for that matter, but anyone who is intentionally engaged in conduct to violate someone's rights. That's simply not acceptable, and it won't be tolerated at the Bureau. But do we make mistakes? We make mistakes. And when we see mistakes, what we try to do is figure out what went wrong, where within our system did the system not work. I mean, it's the same problem that companies have and everybody else has. You need a compliance program that realizes where the problem is, takes steps to correct it, and then has an audit function that looks to make sure that what we're doing has in fact solved the problem. And I think the national security letters, I will say from my perspective, really illuminated it very well for me, because it's a system that operates within the Bureau. And that gave us really a special responsibility that we should have been much more alert to how we were using the tool, and that we had in place appropriate controls and appropriate monitoring to make sure that we were using the tool correctly. So I think we've learned a lot from it, but I think the notion of the question, do you hold your employees accountable, is yes, we hold our employees accountable.
Last question.
Yeah, Ms. Caproni, in your opening remarks, you suggested that Americans, the reason to accept the FISA amendments was that they increased the protections specifically for U.S. persons at the expense of non-U.S. persons. As a U.S. citizen, I feel morally obliged to assure the foreigners in this room that most Americans are as appalled as I am by the government's suggestion that foreigners are any less deserving of respect for their privacy or any other human right than U.S. citizens. And further, that it is that erroneous assumption that foreigners are both less human and more likely to be terrorists that has led to the most recent failure of terrorism prevention, the failure to prevent the most recent terrorist attack by an adherent of a domestic American Christian religious fundamentalist movement in a church in Wichita on Sunday, because of a focus on borders and foreigners rather than the terrorists among us, and on Muslims rather than on Christian fundamentalist terrorists. But I'd like to, having said that, invite any of the panel who may wish to comment on what lessons they would draw from this most recent failure of terrorist prevention, or simply from the fact of that terrorist act on Sunday.
Well, let me respond to the notion that I somehow think that foreigners are less deserving of protection than U.S. persons. That's not true. I don't believe that. And inside the United States, anybody who's here who's not a U.S. person, if we want to tap your computer or your phone, we need a court order to do it. But what I am saying is that the U.S. Constitution doesn't float over the world. And so if one person in Pakistan is communicating with one person in South Africa, there is absolutely no reason why the United States Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court should be involved in issuing an order for that interception, any more than it ever did if we pulled that message off of a satellite. That was never protected under FISA. It was never intended to be protected under FISA, and it doesn't somehow suggest that foreigners are less deserving of respect. What it says is the United States Constitution has limits, and it doesn't extend that far. In terms of the shooting in Wichita, it was tragic, and there's no question about it. It was an absolute tragedy. But I think the FBI can deal with both foreign and domestic terrorists. On this one, it was horrible. I don't know what to say other than that.
So the one thing I've thought about, a lot of people talk about the fact that terrorism is fundamentally a dead-end strategy, that it does not change governments, it does not change political opinion, that terrorist organizations throughout the world pretty much never achieve their political goals. So terrorism doesn't move governments. What's interesting, and I think we've learned that from last week, is terrorism does move individuals, that people are affected by fear. I might have the numbers wrong. I think there were 3 doctors in the country that performed those late-term abortions on women whose lives were in danger, and now there are 2. And I'm sure these 2 are more scared, and I don't know if the 2 are still performing them. And there could be, so we are 2 assassins away from 0. And it's interesting that terrorism at this level will affect people and how they act, even though in a larger scale it pretty much never affects governments and how they act. And I'm not sure what the moral is here, but that is the one thing I've thought about, and how, on a lesson from what happened.
I'll try to be brief. I think it's a mistake to refer to this as a terrorist attack. We get into a zone, we start near a zone where we'll have dueling accusations of terrorism against groups. This is a criminal deed, and the way to suppress criminal deeds is to treat them as criminal deeds. The last thing we want is someone who thinks like this murderer does to say, hey, this is a way I can get in the press too. This is a way I can advance my message by being a terrorist. No, put this guy in an orange jumpsuit, subject him to law, make him look like the loser, the awful assassin that he is. Over.
Yeah, I think we all would agree with that it's there's no good reason to turn this into a terrorist act. It's a politically motivated killing for sure, and you could bring that within the definition of terrorism if you wanted to, but in fact it was an individual killing by an individual nutcase.
Well, thank you for your time, and we have a big round of applause for our panelists.
Live now.